Roger Kaye is retiring from the Fish and Wildlife Service after 45 years in Alaska as a planner, native liaison, airplane pilot, and most recently as a wilderness and Anthropocene coordinator. Roger has a PhD from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where he has taught wilderness, environmental psychology, and the Anthropocene. He is the author of the book Last Great Wilderness, the campaign to establish the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The following is one of the programs that Roger has developed over his career and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service asked him to record.
Well, welcome to the Last Great Wilderness. This is the story of the origin and purposes of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the ideas and the idealism of those who led a 7-year hard-fought campaign to establish it. And we're going to end with the question of what future for this landscape in the emerging Anthropocene exponential age era. The Arctic Refuge is a 19.5 million acre expanse of wildness and ecological wholeness, making up the whole corner of Northeast Alaska. Our story begins in 1952, here at the high mountain lake, Norfolk Lakes, with two National Park Service planners hoping to establish an ultimate national park wilderness. One was George Collins, Chief of Planning for the Park Service, and aptly described as the agency's dreamer of the biggest dreams. The other was Lowell Sumner, a pioneering visionary and ecologist within the Park Service. And the way these two first saw this area and interpreted its values was greatly influenced by one of their friends who had since died. Bob Marshall, whose writings about exploring the Brooks Range and whose audacious 1938 proposal for a permanent wilderness frontier there had preconditioned conservationists to imagine landscape preservation on a vast ecosystem-wide scale in Alaska. And Marshall's pioneering use of the emerging science of psychology to explore the wilderness experience and the wilderness concept expanded the range of values that Collins and Sumner were able to see in this landscape. And so the next summer, while camped below this spire, Collins and Sumner committed themselves to protecting the region, and they began drafting an article extolling its wilderness values. Northeast Arctic, the Last Great Wilderness, initiated the hard-fought 7-year campaign to preserve what became the Arctic National Wildlife Range in 1960, later expanded and redesignated as the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in 1980. Although for practical purposes, a range and a refuge refer to the same thing. So Collins and Sumner were soon joined by Olaus and Marty Meary, who took over leadership of the campaign in 1954. Olaus was president of the Wilderness Society by this time. And they're shown here during their 1956 summer-long expedition in the area. And these four, Collins and Sumner, Olaus and Marty, were soon joined by some of the era's most prominent conservationists. These were the main founders of the Arctic Refuge. Several of these were pioneers in the emerging ecological thinking, and many were leaders in the growing wilderness movement, including Howard Zahniser, who was vice director of the Wilderness Society along with Olaus Meary, and he didn't go on the expedition because he was busy in D.C. writing the first draft of the Wilderness Act. In this regard, it's important to realize that the campaign to preserve Northeast Alaska was concurrent with a larger effort to enact what would become the Wilderness Act of 1964. And many of those who were leading the effort to pass the Wilderness Act were at the same time using the same arguments to preserve what became the Arctic Refuge. And we should keep in mind that both these efforts occurred in the larger context of the post-World War II transformation of America. You know, the 1950s brought us the world's highest standard of living and rate of consumption, but it also brought an unprecedented rate of environmental degradation. So the rapid loss of natural areas, the destructive logging, mining, agricultural practices of the time, the spread of pollution and pesticides, and the fallout and the power of the atomic bomb were among the swift changes that awoke many people in America to a new order of environmental threat. And it led some people, like the Mearys, to wonder if we might even be changing the planet. Alaska's political leaders, however, were not among the supporters of this proposal. They didn't want the march of progress restrained, and they were threatened by what Senator Greening here referred to as the theoretical conceptions of the wilderness proponents. Well, more on those conceptions later, but I'll just say as political opposition to a wilderness park increased, some apparent compromise was necessary, and the proponents decided to advocate for a less restrictive wildlife range. However, Alaska's Senator Bob Bartlett, the most powerful opponent of the proposal, was not among those who were fooled. He knew that the proponents continued to envision this as some kind of a huge archetypal wilderness area. So the question is this: what did this wilderness concept mean to the proponents of this place, and what resources were important, and what theoretical conceptions motivated them? Well, to summarize, the Arctic, this wilderness represented an interwoven set of both tangible and intangible values, and these can be summarized as wildlife, but especially in an ecological context, wildness, scientific value, recreational value, cultural heritage value, bequest value, and a more overarching symbolic value. So with this background, let's take a look at this range of values that underpin the struggle to establish this last great wilderness and that continue in the Arctic Refuge today. Well, first, of course, it was featured as a sanctuary for wildlife, but most importantly, the campaign leaders spoke to the interrelatedness and equal value of all life forms. So it wasn't just the big and charismatic species favored for hunting and viewing that had been the basis for establishing previous wildlife refuges. It was the animal's wild context that was emphasized by the founders, knowing that their natural behavior, their interactions, and their ecological role would continue here. And so wildness was a word that just resonated through the early campaign writings and testimonies. What specifically did these framers mean by wildness? Well, it was a freedom of the area's natural processes, those unseen ecological and evolutionary processes. And campaign leaders used evocative prose, photographs, and art, like this drawing by George Collins, to establish the caribou as the symbolic representation of the idea of a landscape and its life forms that would remain free. But even more than the caribou, those early writings about the range use the wolf as the main carrier of the ideological significance of a place free from the human intent to alter, control, and subjugate nature for our purposes. And I might mention that it was only after I started doing a content analysis of the founders' writings and their congressional testimonies that I began to notice how often they referenced symbolism. So in this statement, Lowell Sumner provided what I think is the most succinct encapsulation of the founders' expansive thinking and their hope for this area. So what is he referring to here? In fact, what word is Sumner avoiding? The E word. Think about it a second. Collins is a federal employee, works for the Park Service. He can't say this word in public, but it represents evolution. The scientific story of creation might continue here. And so wildness is ultimately unfettered evolution. It's this objective condition of a landscape where the ecological and evolutionary processes continue free from human intent. But the fact that we have chosen not to intervene or interfere with these processes makes untrammeled wildness a distinctive human nature relationship as well. It's a relationship of deference for and respect for these processes. So the hope was that the whole ecosystems here and their large-scale processes would be preserved. They'd remain wild. This place was intended to preserve a continuum of intact, fully functioning ecosystems that were large enough to be left alone. And it was this that led the campaign leaders to proclaim this area as a preeminent place of scientific value. This was hoped to be a living museum of how nature functions when we leave it alone. And wilderness was seen to serve human needs that our modern, increasingly urban, commodity-driven culture was leaving unmet. Now, Sandy Jameson is one of the visitors who knows the experience that the founders wanted to be available here. He's a hunter, and he says he could hunt in other areas that have more game. He has an airplane, but he hunts here. Now, this is a transcendent spiritual type of experience that many people have here, although few are able or willing to express it as Sandy does. But it's one component of another prominent purpose for establishing this area, and that is recreation. Oh, it's really a wholly insufficient term for the kind of experience that was intended to be available here. So let's take a look at that experience and consider the attributes of this landscape that are conducive to it. Some are tangible and some are not. So, like many people today, George Soller, who was with the Muries during the 1956 expedition on the Shinjik, found this to be a place of solitude, introspection, self-reflection, and restoration, a common theme that just resonates through the wilderness literature. And contributing to these benefits is the near absence of the reminders of the outside world. And that enables a trip here to become both a means of getting from one place to another and a means of getting from one way of thinking to another. It's a flow experience, and it's so described because after a few days, and you're free of the clock, free of the calendar, the pressure to conform, one feels as if they're just being carried away by the flow here, although for most people it takes several days for the outside world to loosen its grasp on the mind. But this was also intended to be an adventuring ground. It was to be the antithesis of the commercial and convenience-oriented tourism that national parks were promoting at the time. This was to be a place of challenge and self-reliance, hardships, even risk, that sometimes is not enjoyed at the time, but you look back at them and they're the defining elements of the trip. And that reminds us that experience here is much more than the 1 or 2 or maybe 3 weeks spent on site. It's also in the story that one takes home that becomes part of who you are. So one confronts a number of challenges on a trip to the Arctic Refuge. There are risks, like crossing rivers, which statistically is the most dangerous thing you can do in the Arctic Refuge, floating rivers and so on. And you have to be alert for dangers that are unique to the Arctic, like being swept underneath the river ice, overflow ice. And then, of course, there are the bears, and they remind you of your littleness, that you don't dominate this landscape, just their unseen presence heightens your attention. As Muri said, you're not just observing this landscape, you're participating in it. So the refuge founders were concerned that post-war changes were resulting in fewer and fewer opportunities for adventurous and challenging experiences of the type that Bob Marshall had extolled. And it's kind of interesting that Marty Muri wrote very eloquently about this type of experience, this arduous experience. In many ways, she was among the first of women nature writers to extol these qualities of the landscape, the experiential qualities. And sportsmen's organizations supported the Arctic proposal because it would perpetuate opportunities for primitive and adventurous type of hunting. It's all what Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, who visited the Muries during their expedition, summarized as the call to adventure. And we need to remember, as we steward this landscape, that there can be no adventure without the element of what? What quality must we maintain to keep this experience of adventure available? Think about it a minute. The essential quality, and this is true for any kind of adventure, is a sense of the unknown. Some unknown of what lies ahead or what lies within. Can I do it? Can I find my own way? And there are many unknowns in experience to the Arctic Refuge. Water level is just one of them, and this couple, I don't know if they came experiencing a leisurely float down this river or exciting ride, but instead, for miles and miles at the beginning, their experience was a drag. And that reminds us that the defining element of some trips is endurance. And so this intrigue of what lies around the next bend or over the horizon is part of the sense of mystery. That elusive but compelling aura that there's something beyond, something you have to search out yourself here. And so today, there are no what are called recreational developments or improvements in the Arctic Refuge. There are no trails here, no human-made trails, no signs pointing the way anywhere in Arctic Refuge. Because for every management action that would reduce the certainty, reduce the uncertainty of your trip, make the experience more predictable, more convenient, even more safe, something of the original purpose of this landscape would be lost. So this is what we advise visitors, people who write us or call us, want to do a trip in the refuge. It's all part of what makes your experience, your connection, so authentic here. So this is our message. Do come to the Arctic Refuge, but come prepared, both mentally and physically, and come as a guest of this place. Come willing to yield your uses and conveniences to its presence. Now, the Arctic Refuge was also described and advocated for as a place of beauty, or more often it was referred to as aesthetic values, and it was called, they use the word aesthetic because Aldo Leopold used it in place of beauty. And part of that aesthetic effect derived from the area's growing ideological significance. And what Olaus Murie was referring to here was that this place was becoming the representation of ideas and idealism embodied in the wilderness concept. And among those ideas was this notion that wilderness can be a medium for opening people to something within themselves that seeks connection or relatedness to something beyond themselves. And that's why Justice Douglas wrote this pronouncement. This was to be a sacred place for what it is, and also for what it was to be set apart from. And that is apart from the utilitarian commodity orientation that rules the major part of our lives. So very much in contrast to the parks are for people, this is your park slogans that were used by the Park Service at the time. The message here was that this place is not here to serve you. It's here for itself. And that was a very unique justification, especially for setting apart 9 million acres of land. Coming to accept this idea is humbling, but as the founders knew, it's only through humility, this sense of being a small part of something larger, that the deeper benefits of the wilderness experience begin to emerge. And so just paramount in the early writings was this idea that the benefits of wilderness should be timeless. This place was to be a bequest to the future. And over, and in the writings and testimonies about this place, we see people, and the founders, using words like posterity and legacy and obligation to future generations. Experiences like my daughters here had just discovering wolf tracks in the mud. You know, it was such a simple joy compared to the computer games, basketball, TV that bound and shaped their world back in Fairbanks, but was so much more powerful in stimulating their imagination and perhaps really opening them to nature and perhaps even the real nature within themselves. So that brings us to the quiz. I didn't mention earlier there's going to be a quiz, but don't worry, it's a single question, one-word answer quiz. And so, based on what you've heard so far, as a bequest to the future, this place had to be a place of what? Well, one single word do you think best summarizes what this place would represent to future generations? Okay, well, don't worry. Nobody gets this right. It was to be a place of restraint. Why restraint, you wonder? Well, you need to remember that the Arctic Refuge and the Wilderness Act really were basically about three things. The first was preserving the natural condition of a landscape and the experiences you might have there. Everybody knows that. But also it was about maintaining natural processes, where in the wording of the Wilderness Act, they would remain untrammeled or wild. But third, wilderness was also intended to be about us, about exercising that better part of us, willing to restrain ourselves. The Arctic Refuge is an encouraging demonstration and a reminder of our capacity to restrain our immediate interests, uses, and profits so that some remnants of nature and their inhabitants might live unrestrained by us. So the thought of the founders was this, that we as a people are enlarged when we set places apart, not just for the uses or benefits they can provide us, but for how they enable us to see ourselves as a part of a larger community in the larger scheme of things. And this was a grounding of the American wilderness movement, and not coincidentally, it's the universal grounding of all spiritual traditions. Now, among other things, you probably know that wilderness is where we restrain technology. But it's important to note that we don't restrain technology just because of the impacts it might cause, that the technology might leave a scar, squish plants, or cause a disturbance was not the only concern of the founders of the Arctic Refuge or the framers of the Wilderness Act. They also realized that every technology expresses a set of values. You know, it has a worldview built into it. Its use, even its presence, can alter one's experience and their relationship to a landscape. And it reminds us that sometimes we forgo technology for no reason other than as a gesture of respect for what wilderness represents. Now, this is something Marty Murray often spoke to. And after a while, doing research for this project, I began to notice how often the refuge founders placed their advocacy in the larger context of the Earth and the planet and the globe. But I didn't realize the significance of this larger perspective until I found a yellowed letter deep inside Senator Bartlett's archives. Now remember, Senator Bartlett was the leading opponent of the Arctic proposal, and he was going to keep the Arctic Range legislative proposal locked up in his committee. Now, Olaus was desperate. He was concerned that it might not come up for a vote, the proposal for the Arctic Range. And so he sent the senator a letter in which he acknowledged that the question of establishing this Arctic Refuge is bigger than some assumed. And he went on to describe it's more than recreation, more than just wildlife. He said, the question of establishing this area really involves the real problem of what the human species is to do with Earth. So the real problem, the real concern here was human-Earth relations, about this place as where we'll draw the line on our profligate and unsustainable behavior towards nature. Well, the senator wasn't persuaded. He blocked a Senate vote on the refuge bill. The Arctic Refuge was not established by congressional legislation. And so, responding to a great deal of public pressure, the Interior Department Secretary Seaton, under President Eisenhower, established the Arctic Range through an executive order, that is, through the authority of the Antiquities Act. The establishing order stated that this area purpose was for preserving unique wildlife, wilderness, and recreational values. Very unusual purpose for establishing a refuge at that time. No refuge before had been established to, quote, preserve values. So the Fish and Wildlife Service considered this place an anomaly when it became a refuge, and it remains an anomaly to the agency today. So, well, to summarize the legacy of the Arctic Refuge campaign from its origin in Bob Marshall's wild vision for a permanent wilderness frontier, the Arctic Refuge succeeded. The campaign succeeded in establishing the nation's first vast ecosystem-scale conservation unit. And of course, it was one that exemplified the natural qualities that the Murie, Zahniser, and others sought to protect in the Wilderness Act that they were promoting at the time. But there's more to this legacy. This place embodied their more encompassing hope for the wilderness concept, that it might stimulate Americans to think beyond conservation to resources, conservation of resources to protection of whole ecosystems, and beyond that even to rethink their relationship to the larger biosphere that we jointly inhabit. So as intended, the Arctic Refuge did become a symbolic landscape. So I'd say that the founders of the Arctic Refuge were visionaries for sure. They were pioneers, and then, fairly new ecological evolutionary thinking. But we need to remember that they lived and worked in the context of the 1950s conditions and 1950s understandings of global scale change, for which there was virtually none. The best thinking of the time was that you draw a line around an area and make it a refuge, make it wilderness, keep out developments, inappropriate types and levels of use, leave it alone, and it will always be natural. And although they had placed preservation of this place in the larger context of the Earth and the planet and the globe, they couldn't have foreseen the Anthropocene, this emerging era of Earth's history wherein human activities are becoming a dominant, disturbing, and in fact destabilizing force upon the entire Earth system. So when we look at the scientific projections and the models, they predict substantial, although largely unknown, changes to the entire planet, and especially for the resources of the Arctic. So the question, what does the Anthropocene mean for the future of the Arctic Refuge? Well, in 1915, refuge scientists did a meta-analysis of the studies and models that projected the anthropogenic changes that were happening in the Arctic and that would likely shape the Arctic Refuge. This is just a brief summary. So if you believe in best science, this, I'm sorry to say, is the future for the Arctic Refuge, and it's happening already. Widely regarded as the nation's preeminent archetypal natural area, the exemplar of naturalness, the Arctic Refuge will no longer be natural in the next century of the Anthropocene, 2100. It will not be natural, at least as natural has always been traditionally understood. This notion of maintaining what's natural as separate from human affected is becoming increasingly problematic. Humans and nature are becoming more inseparably intertwined, engaged entangled in a hybrid world. And as some are saying now, well, let go of naturalness as a primary conservation goal. Replace naturalness with a more scientific goal like maintaining ecological integrity or biodiversity. But especially when we consider the Arctic Refuge's history, its purposes, and its values, it's clear that nature is more than just an objective ecological condition or baseline condition. Nature also has aesthetic, psychological, spiritual, and symbolic dimensions, and these are prominent in people's experience, valuation, and motivation for protecting and visiting this landscape. So perhaps we can reinterpret natural for this landscape to mean free of intentional human alterations, developments, mechanisms, noises, and other such artifacts, regardless of the degree to which the area's composition and ecology has been changed in response to human caused conditions. So the big question is that Arctic Refuge is facing is, what should we do or what might we do to resist change to our favorite species or current conditions in this landscape? Well, we could employ what's called an ecological intervention, or as is done by refuges in lower 48 refuges. They're called manipulation restoration techniques, and these are some of the tools that are used in the lower 48 refuges, and that includes a manipulation of the hydrological cycle, the system through water impoundments, dikes, dams, guzzlers, as you see here. It includes planting greenhouse-raised, disease-resistant, warm temperature-adapted plants. includes things like geoengineering and genetic engineering. And there are many other interventions that are possible. And I just will say that if interventions are in the future of Arctic Refuge, I hope proponents will carefully consider their potential unintended consequences. And that includes the potential for intervention to impede a resource's or a system's eventual adaptation to the new conditions. But we need to remember that any intervention, however important the resources or the uses it seeks to protect and perpetuate, it diminishes that defining quality of wilderness, which is wildness. Wildness is the condition or the state of a landscape characterized by its freedom from the human intent to alter, control, manipulate its components and ecological and evolutionary processes. Remember, the root word of wildness is not just really wild, but it's also will, referring to the area of the landscape remaining self-willed. And so what we should do is clarify what wildness is not. It's not a synonym for pristine or virgin. There's no such word or synonym for it in the Wilderness Act. Wildness is not the absence of all human effect, and it can persist in environments that have been altered or continue to be influenced by external human factors, such as climate change, as long as we refrain from interfering with nature's autonomous response. So remember that wildness is a condition that's free from human intent. It's not free from human effect. That's what naturalness is, or is supposed to be. But anyway, the Arctic Refuge can always remain wild if we are willing. If we're willing to forego interventions and restoration efforts in the hope of perpetuating, for example, our favorite species in environments becoming less suited to them. If we're willing to designate the Arctic Refuge as a hands-off, non-intervention wilderness area, wherein the ecological systems here would be allowed to adapt and evolve however they will, with us accepting that populations of some preferred species will decline or may be replaced by others more suited to changing conditions. So the changes in the structure and composition of the system would not be resisted, but would rather become part of the natural order of what might become here a novel ecosystem. So to conclude, in the thousands of pages of refuge and campaign articles and testimonies, there were just innumerable calls to leave this portion of our planet left alone, wanting the area to remain natural, as it always been. But the expression that now speaks to me more is the short and very simple statement that Marty concluded her Senate hearing testimony on Senate Bill 1899, the bill to establish the Arctic National Wildlife Range. And I think now is the time to look ahead, not just to the next generation, but to the next century of the Anthropocene, 2100. And it's not that far off, really, just a couple generations. But we should be thinking now about that question. Should we intervene here to maintain or try to maintain the species or conditions that we most like here? Or should we let the area adapt and evolve as it will, remain wild? And it's a wicked question, partly because we don't know, while we know, I should say, that change is certain, we don't know what the change will be, and that's part of the Anthropocene dilemma. But we do know from our 50 to 60-year history of wilderness management now that one well-intended decision to intervene leads to another. It's a decision creep, a slippery slope where, without conscious, considered, and forward-looking decisions, an area becomes more managed and less wild. So the main question of the future I see for this landscape is this: are we willing to let go of current or natural conditions, that is, the products of evolutionary creativity at our point in time, to perpetuate that creative and evolutionary process itself, wildness? So now is the time for that long look ahead to decide what future for the Arctic Refuge and the Anthropocene.